Hello and welcome to this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch, brought to you by the Baker Street Irregulars. I'm Steve Doyle, and I'm your host. Well, I'm really happy to bring this episode to our viewership. As you know, one of my main goals is to bring people on the show who I think Sherlockians should know better or should just get to know, period. And so one of the guest that was high on my list is today's guest, and that is Dan Andriacco. Dan is a solid Sherlockian from Cincinnati, Ohio, who has recently taken over the editorship of the Baker Street Journal. Dan's a great guy, and he's good to know, and I think it's time that a larger audience gets to know him as well. So, without any further ado, welcome to the show, Dan. I'm very happy to have you here today.
It's great to be here.
It is great to be here. It's a great day, and here we are from the Fortnightly Dispatch. So I'm very happy to bring you on the show today. We have a lot to talk about, sir, and here we go. So, Dan, I've often started this show. I think, well, let me back up a second. I think it's a good, as I mentioned in the introduction, I think it's a good opportunity for people to get to know our new Baker Street Journal editor. We don't get a new editor of the journal every day. And so
23 years lately.
Right. It's a long time. Like it's an entire generation of people who, you know, it's a big deal. It really is. And as you know, the show is sponsored by the Baker Street Journal. And so it's only appropriate that you are on the show. So it's a great opportunity to get to know you. So I often start the show by asking our guests where are they, first of all, where are you coming to us from?
Well, from I guess what is now the editorial offices of the Baker Street Journal here in Cincinnati, Ohio, which Arthur Conan Doyle once called the great city of Cincinnati.
Cincinnati is a great city.
It is.
It's a neighbor to my own hometown of Indianapolis here. So there you go.
Yeah.
So I want to follow up with my second standard question, which is, Dan, tell us, how did you meet Mr. Sherlock Holmes?
Who? Well, it didn't start with Basil Rathbone for me. A lot of people in my age cohort, I think, first met Sherlock Holmes either through Basil Rathbone or from reading Speckled Band or Redheaded League in a middle school reader. And that didn't happen for me that way. I had a friend when I was growing up, was about a year older than I was, by the name of Ralph Eppensteiner. And I think I must have been 9 or 10. I usually say about 9. When he introduced me to the character of Sherlock Holmes. And in playing, we would act out what I later found out were stories from the canon. And I remember he lived in a house. It was a rented house down on one end of our street. And I would go into his house, and they had built-in bookcases. And they had, these weren't glass-covered bookcases, but just regular bookcases on either side of a fireplace. And they had the A.L. Burt editions of
wow.
Some of the first publications.
And this is here in Cincinnati.
Yeah, this was in Cincinnati, right? I was born, raised in Cincinnati. I've never really lived anywhere else. So one of these books, so they had the adventures, the memoirs, but A.L. Burt also had an anthology. I remember this very clearly, called Tales of Sherlock Holmes. And my friend said, look, they have repeats, because it had the Scandal of Bohemia in it. Well, I don't know how old I was before I realized that wasn't one of the actual canonical books. It was just an anthology.
Yeah.
So I first, almost certain that I first really read Sherlock Holmes stories from The Boy Sherlock Holmes, edited by Howard Haycraft. And I took it out, borrowed it from the Cincinnati Public Library. Those were days in the early 60s when a 10, 11-year-old boy could get on a bus in a neighborhood of Cincinnati and go downtown on a Saturday morning, and his parents didn't worry about it. And I would spend hours in the library.
Definitely a different world.
No, a very different world. And that's also how I first encountered the Private Life of Sherlock Holmes, Profile by Gaslight. Many of the standard. I read some of the writings about the writings before I even finished reading the canon.
I find that interesting that your library, your public library, was stocking some of these sort of classic volumes of writings about the writings. That's kind of interesting.
This was they were the Misadventures of Sherlock Holmes, I remember. So this was in the days of the card catalog. So you could look up Sherlock Holmes in the card catalog, and it would lead you to all these other books.
The card catalog, for all you kids out there, that was how you found things in the library.
Yeah. The first Sherlock Holmes book that I ever actually owned, was be a familiar book to a lot of people, was the Whitman classics. And it was a version of the Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. It didn't have them all in there, maybe 8 or 9.
Mm-hmm.
And then when I was 12 years old, I remember this very clearly. I bought my own Doubleday complete with my own money, the entire $6.50 when I was 12 years old.
That's a big day.
Yeah.
That's big.
Well, I do remember it because I don't know what the process would have been in those days, how she ordered the book. She somehow secured the book. I came home from school one day, and there was a tea towel on the dining room table. And I got curious. I picked it up, and the complete Sherlock Holmes was underneath it, waiting for me.
Was it a single volume or a double volume?
A single volume. I didn't even know there was a double volume until a number of years later.
Wow. Do you still have it?
I still have it. It's in terrible condition. One of the reasons
that just means it's well loved.
Well, there was a chocolate smudge on it, and then there's a tear stain because I cried when I got chocolate on it. That was when I was a pre-teenager. And then my daughter, when she was about 2 years old, ripped part of the cover.
Oh no.
And one time, the late great Paul Herbert was trying to cage a book off of me. Believe it or not, Paul had this magnificent collection, and I had a book that he wanted, and I wasn't going to give it to him.
Wow.
I said, I can't give you that. My daughter gave me that book. And he said, yeah, but she tore the cover on your Doubleday.
You wanted your Doubleday.
Yes.
Paul Herbert wanted your, wow, that is, you better hang on to that thing.
Yeah. So my original Doubleday is right here in this room.
That's awesome. That's so great. So, okay, so you met Sherlock Holmes, and you kind of fell under his spell.
I did.
So what happened next? I mean, a lot of us read the stories, but it doesn't really take. It doesn't turn you into a Sherlockian.
Yeah, well, that's very interesting because for me, in a lot of ways, it did take. There was my best friend I've known him since 7th grade. He wasn't necessarily my best friend in the 7th grade, but became my best friend in high school and college years, and still today. He's the chancellor of the exchequer of the Tankerville Club, where I'm the most scandalous member, our local Scion Society. And he was the best man at our wedding. All that. So we go down a ways. We've got a history. And I think we talked about Sherlock Holmes in the 7th grade. And there was another classmate of mine in the 7th grade who was a Sherlockian. I didn't know it then, but I found out more than 40 years later that she was a Sherlockian, and I got her to join the Tankerville Club as well. But really, in answer to your question, I think what you really want to know is that all during college years, my friend Steve and I and Anne, who's now my wife, and some other friends of ours, we used to get together and read stories from the canon out loud. So, Sherlock Holmes was very much with me all during college years.
Wow, isn't that something? That's great. That's cool. So when did you? I know that you.
By the way, Steve, this is the first edition of the first issue of the Baker Street Journal that I received when I subscribed during college years.
What year is that?
December 1971.
Little did you know you would be editing the journal.
I
years later.
I didn't know until very recently that I'd be editing the Baker Street Journal.
That's amazing. It's
It
it's
is.
really cool. It is really cool. Well, we'll talk about editing the journal in a while, but so I'm always interested in people's Sherlockian journey, you know.
Sure.
So so you read the stories, and many of us, we fall under the spell, and then we have like an episode like college or something like that, or early adulthood, where we just don't have time for it. But that was not the case for you, it seems like.
Yeah, I
So
think not. I graduated from college in 1974 officially, and I don't know that I did much with Sherlock Holmes in between, except I always remained interested. I wrote for a while a mystery review column for the Cincinnati Post, where I worked as a reporter and then later as business editor. And while I was writing that column, I accumulated a lot of books that way, Sherlockian books. But I guess probably a really major thing that happened was in 1981, I joined the Tankerville Club, where Paul Herbert was the official secretary and founder of the club. And so that was my real introduction to organized Sherlockian activity, organized beyond just three friends getting together to read the stories out loud.
right, that's very interesting. Well, the Tinkerville Club was a great club, still is. Just saying, it is. And
Thanks to all the people who helped.
sure, oh yeah, a club is only as good as its members. I mean, you got
Absolutely.
to have good members. I've been to many Tinkerville Club meetings, and I love going, and I think it's really a fun time. It's
Thank
a
you.
it's a well-run organization. But the let's let's fall back to that moment where you joined the Tinkerville Club. So there's a moment over the course, for all those of you who have watched the Fortnightly Dispatch, you'll hear kind of a recurring theme. It's that sort of moment where someone crosses that sort of threshold into the larger Sherlockian world. And this was your moment when you joined the Tinkerville Club?
I don't think so. Not in the way that you might imagine, because I was still very busy in those years. We had three kids, and I eventually became the business editor of a daily newspaper, which is not a small thing. And I went to the Dayton Symposium for a number of years, but not always. I mean, even Dayton was a bit of a step out for me. So I'm not the sort of person who started going to Sherlockian events all over the country. I never did very much of that. And it was only, 6 or 7 years ago, I started going to the BSI weekend, and that really took me. I knew then, after the first time, that I would always go to BSI weekend. I would consider that in some ways my real first step out of the really broader Sherlockian world.
So interesting. Well, let's talk about your writing career. You have been and still are a mystery writer.
Correct.
So let's talk a little bit about that.
Way back in the 90s, early 90s, when I was, as they say at that time, very, very active as a journalist, I wrote 12 unpublished mystery novels. And
That's a lot. That's a lot of that's a lot.
after a while, you got to say, I'm picking up a pattern here. These rejection letters are telling me something. And then I don't know, maybe it was I was already the business editor then in the early 90s. So I guess that wasn't it. I think it was just get tired of having the door slammed in my face. But at some point I realized, and this was in 2011 or so, I realized I had written a lot about Sherlock Holmes. I'd written a lot of essays and such. So I thought I could put it together as a self-published book. Well, I failed at self-publishing. I could never figure out how to do it. But my friend Joel Center of blessed memory, who used to run Classic Specialties, wife Carolyn, said, I know this guy, Steve MX in London. Why don't you send it to him? So I sent it, and it became my first published book of that sort. I had two books on theology and media published before that, but in this, that was around the year 2000. So that I had those books published. But my first work, my Sherlockian work, was Baker Street Beat, collection of essays in 2011. And Steve Emick said the only requirement is we'd love to publish this, but you're going to have to do a blog. We want you to do a blog. And I thought, well, heck, I ought to be able to do a blog. I've got 40 years of files about Sherlock Holmes. I'll just start writing what I know about Sherlock Holmes. So I started going to my files and I found these mystery novels I had sort of forgotten about. And and two of them featured an amateur sleuth who was a Sherlockian. His name's Sebastian McCabe. And the second of those had a very strong Sherlockian flavor. I rewrote it to make that the first of the series and sent it to MX Publishing, and they published that. And then I rewrote the second one to add a Sherlockian element that wasn't there to begin with. So the first one was No Police Like Holmes. The second one is Holmes, Sweet Holmes. The third one is the 1895 murder. And then there was a disappearance of Mr. James Phillimore. And then after that, they mostly did not have Sherlockian titles until recently I did No Ghost Need Apply, which most of our viewers will recognize as a quote from Sherlock Holmes.
You should recognize that. Let's talk about your first Sherlockian.
Oh, you want me to say my very first piece?
Yeah, come on.
Was published in the Sherlock Holmes Review.
Right? Let's talk about that.
What was that, 89, I think? Something like that?
Yeah, something like that.
Yeah, it was a pastiche. Well, there used to be a great mystery bookstore in Yellow Springs, Ohio, called Mysteries by the Yard, run by Mary Frost Pearson. And she offered a pastiche writing contest. And the prize was a $100 gift certificate. Man, that is real money. $100 gift certificate in a bookstore, a mystery bookstore. So I wrote so I wrote that, my first pastiche. John Vincent Hardin, one of the famous unpublished cases of Sherlock Holmes.
That was your first Sherlockian publication, wasn't it?
Yes, it was my first published fiction of any kind.
Yeah. I remember getting it.
Radio plays or broadcast, but that was my first published fiction.
Right. We got that. I remember I was editing, still am now, editing again, Sherlock Holmes Review. And I get this submission in the mail, because that's how you got them back in those days.
Yes.
In the snail mail.
Of my award-winning short story.
So yes, award-winning. I read it and I thought, well, yeah, I see why it won an award. It was great. Well printed. And so we did.
And one thing about that story that you may not know is that every character in it is named after a member of the Tankerville Club.
I don't think I did know that. Well, we get it at Sherlock Holmes Review. I can just say this, tell this story. And we'd never really published any fiction prior to this, but it was that good. I was grateful to get it. I didn't know Dan from The Man in the Moon, and we got it, and I accepted it. I think we ran it over 2 issues, didn't we?
We did. That is correct.
Yeah.
Later on, it was republished then in Baker Street Beat.
I'm proud to have been your first Sherlockian publisher, Dan. I really am.
You were.
You're
still my publisher.
Still your publisher after all these years.
Yeah, in fact, when I first actually met you in real life at a Gillette de Brett, maybe Gillette de Brett 3, the first thing you said to me was, I published your first fiction.
Right, I remember.
I didn't know it until you told me. I didn't know that you were the Sherlock, or I had forgotten that you were the Sherlock Holmes Review.
Yeah. By Gillette de Brett, Sherlock Holmes Review had passed into history before it was resurrected. But I remembered you. Hey, Dan, let's take a moment and hear from our sponsor, the Baker Street Journal. I want to talk to you about your your path to taking on the journal. I think that's an interesting one. I I know a bit about it. And what is your opinion of the Baker Street Journal's place in our collective Sherlockian history?
Well, what I like to say is that I think it's kind of like the lingua franca of the Sherlockian world. It's published by the Baker Street Irregulars, but it's not just for the Baker Street Irregulars. And one of the theme of my very first gas lamp, editor's gas lamp, in the first issue is the charm of variety, which is a quote from Sherlock Holmes. And what I hope is that each issue under my editorship will have a lot of variety in different kinds. You know, there's always going to be a place, and a very strong place, for what you might think of as traditional Sherlockian scholarship, you know, playing the game, you know, totally looking at it from a Sherlockian point of view. But I think there's also room for Doylean essays. There's room for historical pieces. There's room for some popular culture. Not every piece has to appeal to everybody, but we hope that every piece has some broad appeal. Not 100% appeal, but broad appeal. And that everybody will find, every Sherlockian or Holmesian will find something in every issue of the Baker Street Journal that appeals to them.
What do you have a personal specific area of interest within our Sherlockian world? I mean, you know, some people are collectors. Some people are, I'm only interested in Sherlockian film or television. You know, do you have a particular area of interest?
Well, I shock people by saying I'm not a collector. Some people don't believe that. I mean, I have a lot of books, but you know, Steve, very well, that does not make you a collector.
No, it does not.
By any means. And, you know, I'm totally happy with having a facsimile of facsimiles. I think are really helpful for me lots of times to go and see what something actually looked like. You know, one of the stories, how it actually first appeared. But to me, I wouldn't have any particular interest unless I could get it at a really good price in getting the original. I have a few originals. I could tell you one if you want later on. But my own, the majority of my own writings, both in the Baker Street Journal and in Sherlock Holmes Mystery Monthly and in various Scion publications, has generally been around the area of what I might call literary criticism. You know, I've written about Gothic themes in the canon. I've written about major plot tropes in the canon. And then I've done maybe a little bit more frivolous or fun pieces about Freddie the Pig and his relationship to Sherlock Holmes, and Sir Henry Merivale, the John Dickens Carr character, and his relationship to Sherlock Holmes. So I approach it mostly from a literary point of view, but I'm also interested in reading history.
Yeah, it's interesting. The that's your personal
Yes,
angle of interest,
right.
So when it comes to the journal, I think the journal really holds a very important place in our collective history. I mean, I think it informs so much of our hobby. And even those people are maybe a relatively new Sherlockian who's come in, whose entry point may be, well, how do I, you know, like a TV show or fan fiction, something like that. Once they're in this universe, they're in a universe that has been largely fueled by the Baker Street Journal, even if they don't really understand that. And I think that's my opinion anyway. And I think the journal is quite important because of that. I find it interesting that of what your personal interest is. How much of that informs your editorial choice in submissions?
Well, that's an interesting question, because there is such a thing as I guess you could say editorial taste, which you just can't get around. You know, there are some pieces that I find interesting, and I think, you know, we want to have in the journal that maybe somebody else wouldn't think. And there's, you know, at some point it has to come down to somebody's opinion. And
Right.
one of the things I do for that reason, there are a lot of pieces that I've gotten so far that I thought were not really right for us, but might be right for some other publications. So I have a list of other Sherlockian publications that I suggest to a writer, this really isn't a good fit for us, but try these. And it's not something you can define completely.
Yeah.
I can define it to a degree, but not completely. I don't know that I can define it any more than what I said, that we want to have a large variety.
So let's talk about our staff on the journal.
Okay, let's.
So, people sometimes they think of me, but they now they think of you, but we have help, don't we? We have help on the journal.
At the recent Holmes Doyle and Friends, I asked Mike McSwiggan to conduct an auction for us. And he said, I think I'm number 2 in just about everything that Dan does. So he's the number 2 guy in the Tankerville Club with the title of second most dangerous member. And he is my associate editor. The very, very early days of the Baker Street Journal in 1946, there were associate editors. There haven't been any for a long time. But I thought I needed some good help to do this, and I asked Mike to be my associate editor, and I'm really glad that he said yes. So he'll be performing, any number of chores. I mean, one of the major things is just a sounding board, because I have my own judgment, but lots of times I like to bounce things off of him or you, frankly. But he'll also be, for the most part, conducting the book reviews, the Baker Street inventory, and he'll be doing the indexing, and whatever else I ask him to do as my loyal henchman, as I call him.
Mike is a great loyal henchman.
Mike gets around the Sherlockian universe a lot more than I do, and that's a real benefit.
Well, let's talk about the Sherlockian universe there, Dan. You talked about going to New York. Let's talk about your first visit to New York for the BSI weekend. What was you referred to it as sort of a kind of a watershed moment for you. Was it? I mean, talk about that and what it did for your perception of
I don't think I can, I'm not sure that I can recall it to that extent, but basically, there's just no other way I can say this. You really took me under your wing, and I spent a lot of time hanging out with you, and you showed me how this thing worked, and took me different places.
Yeah, but that's what I wasn't really asking about, that to get me in the picture.
Oh,
I know what it. I'm kind of.
But that's a big, it's a very social weekend, and I
Yes.
would not have known a lot of people there if I hadn't been introduced. On the other hand, I got a great story for those of you who have not been, to give you an idea of what can happen. The very first day that we were there was, the weekend kind of begins unofficially. I mean, it's not a BSI sponsored event. The Ash Wednesday dinner, sponsored by Adventures of Sherlock Holmes. Well, that evening, Ann and I were talking to a fellow who was a New York lawyer. And I was talking about how I couldn't tell you for how long I've been madly in love with the Chrysler Building. And on our way there, it's dark at night. I cross a street. I happen to look down the street, and there's the Chrysler Building all lit up. That actually is one of the things I most remember from that first trip. It was an absolutely magic moment. Yeah. So I'm telling this guy about it. His name was Michael Bush. He says, "Oh, my law office is right across from the Chrysler Building. Why don't you come up?" So we made an appointment on Saturday after the BSI luncheon. We went and looked at the Chrysler Building from his window, right up at the top there.
Wow.
And we stood out on the balcony. It was snow covered. It was cold and it was snow covered. So he thought that he owed us better than that. So next year we came and did the next thing. Anyway, my wife and I really hit it off with Michael Bush and his wife Lois. And now we meet up together for the Sons of the Copper Beaches in Philadelphia. And Michael and Lois are coming to Cincinnati to stay at our house for 3 or 4 nights in May. I mentioned that as an example of what can happen, when you make friends through Sherlock Holmes.
That weekend is sort of making friends on steroids in a way, isn't it? I mean, am I right? It is. I think that going to New York and kind of that full immersion into that established Sherlockian universe is there's nothing like it. I don't believe there's anything like it. So
One of the things
anybody
I
who
tried to do in the Sherlock in our own Tankerville Club is to give our members a window into that broader universe. So
yes,
even before I became the editor, I was encouraging people to subscribe to the Baker Street Journal, and I would talk to them about it and about the history of the Baker Street Journal.
let's talk about the Sherlockian universe. You know, it's a I just personally had a was interviewed recently by a newspaper reporter about, you know, about Sherlock Holmes and the universe, and he was obviously he knew nothing about it until he'd done a little research. He was just kind of agog at the fact that there's this strange, really kind of unprecedented.
Bizarre would be a good word.
Bizarre is not a bad word. That is not a bad word. Universe. How do you describe? How do you describe and how do you understand this? Because you know, for many people in our hobby, you know, the Sherlockian universe is kind of a defining thing. You know, I mean, it's kind of the world we live in. How do you think about it? How do you understand it?
You know, I've grappled with that, and the reason that I have grappled with it is I've never applied the word hobby to it. And I wouldn't say that that's not a correct word. It's just a word that I've never used. And I remember the first time I ever heard somebody use that word, hobby, and it just kind of took me aback. I don't know. I don't know what I would call it. And I guess I've been living with it for so long, at least in my head, even before I got to
Right.
to associate with the larger Sarlackian universe. I guess it's hard for me to put a word to it or a description of it.
Yeah. Well, I kind of know what you mean, personally speaking. I mean, hobby is a word I've started using because it's become sort of it's got currency in now. But for me, it really was
I
more.
don't say
It's
it's a
more
wrong
hobby is
word.
like collecting stamps to me. Like,
Exactly.
yeah, I collect stamps or I collect baseball cards or something. But this, you know, let's be honest. It's kind of a lifestyle in a way, and it's kind of a immersive sort of experiential thing.
Yeah,
If you really go in, I don't know. It's
it's
I don't know
almost
anything
like
like it.
no, it's almost like being a member of an order, like the Order of the Holy Sepulchre or the Masonic Order or something like that.
Yeah,
I mean, you're kind of like part of a tribe when you find out that somebody is a Sherlockian. I don't know. I suppose it's the same way for hobbies, like stamp collectors.
I don't know. Is it? I
I
don't know.
don't know. I wouldn't know. I don't collect anything.
Yeah, not being a stamp collector, I don't know. I've known Sherlockian stamp collectors, but I
I'm
don't
sure.
know any stamp collectors. But you know what I mean. I mean, it's like, gosh, it's hard to put in words. But let's put it this way: I would say the vast majority of my friends and acquaintances at this advanced state of life probably have some Sherlockian connection.
Well, it's a common interest, and you always know where you are with that. And let's be honest, in this world today, with political and cultural dislocation, and people, it's a safe space, I guess you might want to say, for some people. There are people who can get together and talk comfortably about Sherlock Holmes that would have a hard time maybe talking about other things together.
Yeah, yeah, that's true. I just find it, I find it to be a world that we are, well, it is unprecedented to me. I think it's a world that's, inclusive and welcoming, to use that word, and and right, it's where people who might otherwise never cross paths. I don't know, there's something kind of profound about it. I've been thinking about it lately, and I can't quite put my finger on what I'm trying to say or get at, but
There's
I'm
nothing else.
curious about other people's ideas about it.
I think there's nothing else quite like it. mean, of course, you have Jane Austen societies and you have the Wolf Pack, but there are differences. There's nothing quite like the Sherlockian community, I think.
I think that's true.
And one of the things that, at least as far as I know, that's somewhat different is that we are continue to attract young people. Some of the
Is that
other,
true? I think that's true. You know, there's a kind of a thing in the Sherlockian universe, or where like, oh, we need to attract younger people. We need young people, and but we do get young people. We do, certainly younger than you and I,
well, most people are.
right? And so, I mean, it seems like we get enough. We always get enough, and
Well, I think a fascinating thing is that some people who have developed an interest in Sherlock Holmes because of the Robert Downey Jr. movies, or more notably Sherlock, have developed an interest in canonical Holmes too. That's a very good thing.
Yeah, it's always kind of the way.
Obviously, some people who were attracted to Sherlock, BBC Sherlock, faded away, but not all of them.
It was kind of predictable. I think, the tide washes in, and when the tide goes back out, it leaves a percentage of people who stick. And I think that's it's always kind of been the way with every incarnation of Sherlock. I mean, Sherlock Holmes, even Holmes himself said there's nothing new under the sun. The wheel turns and the same spoke comes up again and again. Right. And in our Sherlockian universe, you can look back at every generation of, Holmes is evergreen. He comes back. There's always a spike in popularity as he's sort of rediscovered in some way. And
that is one of the things that is a little bit of a challenge in being the editor of the Baker Street Journal, is in dealing with writers, is to make sure that they do the research. I certainly haven't read everything that's been written everywhere about Sherlock Holmes, and if I did, I would forget it anyway. So I need, somebody thinks that they have, a brand new idea. Somebody, they need to do the research and find out whether they do or not. And for instance, somebody came to me with what sounded like a good idea, except it also sounded familiar to me because I thought I heard a talk on that subject. And I went to the person that I thought did a talk on that subject, and he said, yeah, and I also made it into an article in the BSJ, and it won the Morley Montgomery Award. So I was able to go back to the writer who proposed that and said, well, if you're going to do this, you got to come up with some completely new angle.
That's funny.
It's hard. The research
it is hard.
Sometimes is rather hard, even with the electronic BSJ. That it's a great tool to go research a particular subject, but it's sometimes you might come back with 100 hits, and you have to go back looking at different articles to look at it.
So we're getting short on time. Can you believe it?
I can't believe
it. Fast. Okay, so I just want to talk to you a little bit about your I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about your great work you've done at the outstanding regional conference, the Sherlock Holmes, Arthur Conan Doyle and Friends conference in Dayton, Ohio. Talk a little bit about that. I've been going to the Dayton, the as we call it, the Dayton Symposium,
right,
since the late 1980s, and it's risen and fallen in quality and attendance and all that. But in the last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, this thing it's getting better and better. Talk about that and your role in it. I mean, I know you have a lot of help, and you're not the only person, but just talk about that, the resurgence of this event. And I'm just going to say now, you all should attend it.
Well, the conference hit its height in 1991 with 118 participants. It hit its low with 18 participants. And then it went on pause, and then the person who had been doing it there in those bad days at the end withdrew, and the Agra treasurers took it over. So I think that, first of all, really important to acknowledge that it was a science society called the Agra Treasurer that took it over and rebranded it as Holmes, Doyle and Friends. I volunteered to take over as program chair. Well, actually, I don't ever think I did. I think I volunteered to help, and the next thing I knew, I was doing it.
That's what happened.
Harbaji did a great job, but he didn't really have the tentacles out into the Sherlockian universe very far. I could not have done this if I hadn't started going to BSI weekend and mingling around and getting to know other people and to know who to ask.
It's kind of that testimony to networking and getting to know people.
Right. Yeah. It's what I brought to the table was just knowing who to ask. And people were kind enough to say yes.
Yeah, it never hurts to ask.
And I will say there too, one of the things I look for is variety. For one, we have 8 speakers. I try to make sure that it's pretty evenly balanced between men and women, but also evenly balanced between all kinds of different topics. And I thought, to be honest, I've got a really had a lot of great feedback on this last one. And I think part of it was that all the speakers were, had some degree of humor. And that's something I'm going to make sure that we get a lot of next time, because people love it. And there's no reason you can't be humorous, even about a fairly serious subject in the world of Sherlockiana.
Agreed. Well, it's seen a real resurgence. And as somebody who's been attending this thing, like I said, since 1986, it's probably as good as it's ever been. And as far as I'm concerned, and what kills me is it's annual. I mean, as many of you know, I've done conferences, weekend conferences and stuff, and I know it's difficult to do this thing. And that it's being done annually, I think, is really commendable.
Yeah, I think it's gotten a lot of good attention by word of mouth. It's relatively small. It's about between 70 and 75 people, and it won't get much larger than that. It's probably the least expensive of all the different conferences, and the hotel is not expensive. The hotel is going to be completely remodeled for next year, and I think Dayton is fairly easy to get to for a lot of people.
Well, I would just recommend it to any viewers who are interested in attending something that's affordable and absolutely top quality. It's a highlight of my Sherlockian calendar now, and I look forward to it every year. So
good, glad to hear that.
Yeah. Well, Dan, this is it. We're done, sir. Okay. We did it. I want to thank you for being on the show. It's great. I was really happy to have this opportunity as publisher of the Baker Street Journal. I think I wanted to take this opportunity to introduce our readers and subscribers to our new editor. It's a big job that Dan is taking on here, and it's a big job you took on, Dan. And I'm grateful that you said yes.
Well, it's a cliche, but I was truly honored to be asked, surprised and honored.
Well, I'm very grateful that you said yes. It's as you're learning, I know you're drinking from the fire hose, as they say. It's a big job, and yeah, I'm really grateful.
It's time consuming, but very, very rewarding.
Yeah. Well, I'm happy. It's great, and you'll all be, subscribe to the journal. That's all I can say. All right, Dan, thanks. That's it. Yeah. We're out. I will see you again soon here, sir. I'm very sure. So
okay, very good. Thanks a lot, Steve.
And that's it for this episode of the Fortnightly Dispatch. I want to thank Dan for being on the show. I was grateful for the opportunity for you all to meet him and get to know him better. I'm a broken record, but I want to thank you for the wonderful feedback that we've been getting with the return of our show. It's so valuable and affirming in what we do, and it's really, really appreciated. I just want to encourage you all to come back for our next episode, which will once again feature a terrific guest. And until then, I want to say thanks, and we'll see you soon.
Hi, my name is Bob Katz. I'm a member of the Baker Street Irregulars, and I'm the co-publisher of BSI Press. But more importantly, I'm a subscriber to the Baker Street Journal since 1973.
Hello, my name is Ralph Hall from Louisville, Kentucky. I am a member of the Baker Street Irregulars. I have subscribed to this journal I'm holding here before me, the Baker Street Journal, for 40 plus years.
Hi, I'm Monica Schmitz, and you should subscribe to the Baker Street Journal.
Hi, I'm Scott Monty from I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere, the website and podcast about the connection between Sherlock Holmes and popular culture. You know, the Baker Street Journal has been a wonderful sponsor of I Hear of Sherlock Everywhere and Trifles, our companion podcast, for many years. And when you think about the connection between Sherlock Holmes and popular culture, the Baker Street Journal has always been there.
I have literally read every issue of the Baker Street Journal since the old series in 1946.
It's full of Sherlockian scholarship and humor. The artwork on the cover is wonderful.
People take their interest from today and imbue it into the Baker Street Journal in every single issue. And if you're not subscribing, you're missing out on some of the most fascinating and lively scholarship in the Sherlockian world today.
And basically, if you don't read the Baker Street Journal, I don't know why you're being a Sherlockian.
This is where it's at.